The next question I guess I certainly started to ask, and have been asking it this year pretty intensely, is why these trees are still alive. Because you go to anything on the web or any of the textbooks and they'll tell you that Platycalyx in particular is not the most salt tolerant tree. It's in fact listed as a salt sensitive tree. And yet we were growing it in soils and groundwater that were sort of up there in the high to very high levels of salinity. So even though we've got a water table here at 4 metres, don't forget the capillary fringe above that's rising 1.5 metres. So we've got quite a lot of salt sitting between 2.5 metres and 4 metres, and a hell of a lot of residual salt sitting above that again. And we've been able to map that through the profile as well. These sugar gums, if you look around as you're walking through, are not just surviving, they're thriving. We haven't had any rainfall in here for the last month. We had 4 millimetres of rainfall in September, and yet if you look around at the Platycalyx, they've all got new growth coming out the top of them. All of that led us pretty quickly to saying, well, I think we've got the science a bit wrong. I think the thing, and it became obvious that the thing that's been killing a lot of these eucalypts is the fact that they get waterlogging at the same time. They normally get waterlogged at the same time as they get the salt, and they can't handle both things at the same time. They seem to be able to handle quite high levels of salinity, but not waterlogging. And in this country, the winter rainfall got turned off in 1996, almost overnight, practically overnight, and we've been in drought ever since. And that drought means that we no longer get seasonal waterlogging in the winter, which means that the trees actually are doing very nicely, which is quite interesting.
Phil, let's say we got a couple of wet years. What would you predict might happen here?
This site, where the trees are, will get wet, it'll go underwater, but if we have a week, it'll drain. It'll drain away again. And that might be enough, but it'd be pretty scary if it got very wet indeed. Because it'll drive these trees into a physiological response, basically, that they might or might not be able to recover from.
We had a rainfall event of 132 millimetres last December. The water table came back to the surface. This was all underwater, but because it happened in summer, the trees pulled it back down.
Yeah, so that was in mid-December of last year, and by around about May, June, the water table was back down to 4 metres again.
Okay.
Now you're not going to do this everywhere, so then it comes back to the hydrogeology and the fight that goes on between the trees and the groundwater. And at the moment here, the groundwater system can't put the water back as fast as the trees are actually taking it out, so you win.
So that changes really on the landscape level.
Yes.
You might be asking why not treat the recharge zone rather than the affected zone, but under growing conditions that sort of changes
Totally.
Everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, and what you just said, the whole system really hasn't caught up with yet. So, public policy doesn't change very quickly from when the science is actually revealed, if you like. So a lot of the salinity management plans that came out in Victoria, when I was involved with nearly all of them, talked about treating the recharge areas. Well here, if we sowed trees up on that ridge here, no water went into that groundwater system over the last 12 years, so why are we doing that? That becomes the question. And then if the whole philosophy, if the whole understanding has changed, so that if these areas are not going to be waterlogged, and we can grow trees down here, then it makes sense to actually reverse your policy, so to speak. And so you've got to be careful, because a lot of people come in and say, well, hang on, all this work was done 10 or 20 years ago that shows this and this and this. And then your immediate response is, well, hang on, if you look at the numbers, the climate changed in '96, and we're now in a drying climate. Before that, we were in a wet climate. And so you get very different answers.
So in fact, this part of the landscape is now the most productive, whereas it would have been considered to be the least productive bit.
That's right.
Yeah.
I
think your question earlier, Geoff, about there are sceptics even in our group who say that if we get some wet years, these trees will all fall over. But we think now they're so well established, and you look at the remnants both south and north that have been there for 200 or 300 years and have put up with those waterlogging conditions. We reckon that they will win any battle.
It depends. It sort of depends on their biomass and their current concentrations of particular cations in their foliage as well, though, doesn't it?
Well, that's the next thing that I was going to mention, because that's what I've been chewing my way through over the last 6 to 12 months, is the osmotic pressure in this stuff, this ground, because of the salt concentration, is huge. And if you've got a salinity of around, a groundwater salinity of around 26,000 milligrams per litre, or even say 20,000 milligrams per litre, in old units, that means that you have to put in a pressure of about 200 pounds per square inch to actually separate the water, the fresh water out of that salt water, to overcome the osmotic pressure alone. And when I looked at the number, I looked at the trees, that just raises a whole bunch of interesting questions, and that sent me off talking to a whole bunch of plant physiologists. And as you say, the response seems to be, well, not seems to be, the response is that the trees actually produce their own organic salts as what they call osmoprotectants, and stick that in their cell structure again, so that the osmotic pressure isn't too great between the outside of the tree and the inside of the tree. So things like glycine beta and proline and a whole bunch of other interesting salts come into play. And then on top of that, they've also got to maintain with their leaf area a fairly high xylem pressure to be able to suck the water out. Those two things together give them the capacity to actually make it all work. So that's why it gets interesting when we talk about pruning, is what happens if you take half the leaf area off that tree there. What does that do to your xylem pressure? Is the thing going to collapse on you, or will it continue to transpire? What will it do? And that's probably the next bit of research that we're probably going to have a go at, just to see if we can pick those differences. Around about 12 months ago, Mel and I thought, well, we can do a lot of talking about what happens to the groundwater system, but we really need to be able to have a look inside the trees and see what's happening there. So we invested in some sapflow technology. Again, another gadget, which probably explains why they call me the gadget man amongst this group. This is the database and transmitter that drives all of that. The guts of the thing are basically a large database, effectively a computer, with a modem here, hooked up to an aerial, and it means that basically I can look at these things anytime I want from my computer at home. Just a matter of tapping on an icon, the icon dials up the instrument, and I download from the database. So we read it again at 10-minute intervals, sap flow through the trees through the day. The other gadget, I guess, is these things here. They're data loggers that simply drop down the bore, sit underneath it and measure the change in groundwater head over the top of it. And again, I can store up to 2 years of information on that. So instead of coming out once a month or once every 3 months, again, I can see exactly what happens to the water table at each 10-minute interval, which means I can see the effect of rainfall events and those kind of things as they come through. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the tree is using around 600 to 650 mils an hour. So by the end of the day, at the moment they're using around 6 or 7 litres of water a day. Yeah. Multiply that up by 20,000 trees and that's a fair bit of water. Yeah.